On my 40th birthday, in front of 80 guests, my wife pointed at my mother and screamed, "This table is for family! Get out!" Then the wine glass slipped from her trembling hands, exploding against the marble floor as the room fell silent. My name is Clara Morales, and I am 65 years old. I once taught music at a small community school, guiding children through scales and harmonies, teaching them to find their voice. After my husband passed away, I sold our modest home and moved in with my only son, Adrian, in Miami. He had built himself into a successful businessman, the kind of man whose name appeared in newspapers for charitable donations and real estate ventures. People admired him, and that admiration extended to his wife Isabella, who carried herself with a polished grace that seemed untouchable. From the outside, we looked like a family blessed with success, respect, and love. Inside, however, the air was poisoned. That night, as the guests froze in silence, my knees buckled slightly. My hand clutched the edge of the chair for balance, but the shame was heavier than my body. I saw the shock in the eyes of neighbors, the forced smiles of Adrian's colleagues, the polite coughs of people desperate to look away. And then, worst of all, I caught Adrian's glance across the table. He didn't speak, didn't rise, didn't protect me. His silence was an invisible knife pressed against my chest. For 5 years I had endured Isabella's quiet cruelties. She was a master of disguise, a generous hostess to the world, but a ruthless warden behind closed doors. Every morning I rose early, arthritis stiffening my fingers to cook clean polish and prepare meals that she later accepted praise for. Every evening I swallowed my pride as she reminded me I was a guest in the house I had partly paid for. And every night I prayed my son would see through her mask, though deep down I feared he never would. But this humiliation, this public stripping of dignity, was different. Something shifted inside me as the shards of glass scattered across the polished marble, tiny red rivers of wine bleeding into the cracks. I had been invisible before. Now I was exposed raw under the harsh gaze of 80 strangers. My throat burned with unshed tears, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of watching me cry. The irony crushed me. I had planned to give Isabella a gift that night, an envelope I had saved for years, a sacrifice from my meager Social Security checks. $60,000 carefully folded bills meant to prove my worth in a house where I was treated like a burden. But as I stood there, my palms stinging from gathering broken glass, I realized no amount of money could buy dignity or love that was freely given once, but now felt lost. I remember the silence more than the noise, the way forks hovered midair, the way the air thickened with awkwardness, the way time seemed to stretch until I thought I would collapse under its weight. Yet in that silence, a strange calm stirred within me. I had been pushed to the edge, but I would not fall. Something inside whispered that I had endured long enough. That night marked the beginning of a decision I could no longer ignore. I would no longer be the invisible widow cowering in the shadows of her son's glamorous wife. I had lived 65 years, and I still had my voice. And one day soon, I would use it. When the guests finally turned their heads back to their plates that night, I retreated to the shadows of the dining room. My heart was pounding, but not from shame alone. Memories began rushing back, the choices that had led me into Isabella's glittering house, into this life of quiet servitude that no one ever suspected. After my husband Miguel passed away, the walls of our little home echoed with emptiness. The piano in the living room, once alive with his humming, became a coffin of soundless keys. The mortgage was too heavy, the loneliness heavier still. So I sold the house where I had raised Adrian, packed what little I had, and moved into his grand Miami villa. I told myself it was temporary, that I would be cared for, that family would fill the silence. Instead, I walked into another kind of emptiness, one where I existed, but not as a mother, not even as a person. Isabella welcomed me with that smile of hers, flawless, and practiced the kind that charmed neighbors and dazzled Adrian's business partners. She knew how to make people adore her perfect posture, perfect words, perfect laughter that sparkled like champagne in a crystal flute. People often whispered, "Adrian is lucky to have her." And yes, perhaps he was lucky in business and appearances in the life others envied. But luck for him meant a prison for me. Adrian was too busy to notice. His phone never left his hand, his mind always on real estate contracts and investors. He saw Isabella's beauty, her elegance, her charm, but he didn't see how her eyes narrowed like blades when she looked at me. He didn't hear the clipped tone she used when guests weren't around. To him, I was simply there, a presence in his home, a quiet fixture in the background. So I cooked. I scrubbed floors until my knees ached. I ironed shirts and polished silverware until my fingers cramped. And every time someone complimented Isabella's immaculate home or delicious cooking, she accepted the praise with a tilt of her head and a modest smile, while I stood in the kitchen invisible. The worst part wasn't the labor, it was the erasure. To live in the very house my son owned, yet feel like an intruder in it. To hear Isabella's laughter fill the rooms while my own voice was reduced to silence. I had once taught children to sing to play to express themselves without fear. Now I lived like a ghost, unseen, unheard, stripped of dignity, one small cruelty at a time. That night at Adrian's birthday, when the glass shattered, it wasn't the beginning of my humiliation, it was the climax of years of it. And something inside me knew this silence. My silence could not go on forever. As I bent down to gather the shards of glass that night, the world around me blurred. The marble floor was slick with wine, and each fragment cut into my palm as if to remind me I was still alive, still capable of feeling pain. The voices of the guests rose again, laughter forks against porcelain, but for me, everything moved in slow motion, the sound muffled as though I were underwater. I had endured so much over the years that humiliation had become almost ordinary. Yet something about that moment, the sting of wine on my skin, the sharp edges biting into my fingertips, lit a cold fire inside me. I remember thinking, this is what I've been reduced to. A woman on her knees sweeping up the pieces of a life that no longer belongs to her. The irony was cruel. I had raised Adrian to be strong, to chase his dreams, to build the very empire that Isabella now paraded as her own achievement. And there I was, invisible at his side, dismissed, as if my years of sacrifice were worth less than the shards I was forced to clean. When I finally lifted my head, I caught sight of someone I hadn't noticed before, Lucia, my granddaughter, 17 with her father's dark eyes and my husband's stubborn jawline. She had been standing in the doorway, half hidden behind the velvet curtains, watching everything. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together as if holding back words that could shatter the fragile performance Isabella had orchestrated for the evening. But it was her eyes that pierced me, most wide wet, glistening with tears she refused to shed. Our gazes locked, and for a fleeting second I saw my reflection in her expression, the silent witness to cruelty, the desperate wish to speak, but the fear of making things worse. She looked at me as if she wanted to run forward to help me gather the pieces, but her hands stayed frozen at her sides. I understood. At 17, she was still under the roof, under the rules, under the spell of her mother's iron smile. That look, however, did something to me. It broke something open that had been sealed for too long, because it wasn't just about me anymore. If I allowed this cycle of silence to continue, what lesson would I leave behind for Lucia? That dignity can be trampled without consequence, that a woman's place is always in the shadows, carrying trays and burdens no one acknowledges no. I would not let my granddaughter inherit that silence. I gathered the last shard and rose to my feet, my back aching, but my resolve hardening like steel. Isabella had already turned her attention back to her guests, laughing too loudly, her voice dripping with false charm. Adrian, poor, blind Adrian, was caught between conversation and confusion, pretending nothing had happened to save face. But inside me, the decision had already been made. Enough. That single word rang in my mind like a bell, clear and undeniable. Enough years of swallowing insults, enough pretending not to hear the mockery in Isabella's tone, enough sacrificing my pride for the sake of keeping peace in a house that no longer felt like home. I had been a teacher once. I had shown children how to use their voices. Now at 65, I would reclaim my own. I didn't speak that night. I wasn't ready, not yet. But as I wiped my hands with a linen napkin and walked past Lucia, I let my fingertips brush against hers. It was the faintest of touches, but it carried a message: I see you, and I will not let this go. Her shoulders eased slightly, and though she said nothing, I could see the silent relief in her trembling smile. The party continued as though nothing had happened, as though the shattered glass had been just an accident, a footnote in an evening of wealth and celebration. But I knew better. That night was no accident. It was the breaking point, the moment when the quiet, obedient widow inside me finally died. And though no one else in the room could hear it, I did. The sound of my silence ending. The beginning of something far more dangerous for Isabella than my obedience had ever been. That night, after the last guest had left and the house had fallen into uneasy silence, I sat alone in my small upstairs room. The laughter and clinking glasses from the party still echoed in my ears, but beneath it all was the image of Lucia's tear-filled eyes, a mirror of my own. I opened the drawer of my old oak desk, the one piece of furniture I had kept from my former home, and pulled out an envelope I had been hiding for months. Inside lay $60,000, my life's careful savings gathered dollar by dollar from my Social Security checks, from skipped medications, from teaching piano lessons, to neighborhood children who could only pay in crumpled bills. I had once believed this money could buy me peace. My plan had been foolish to give it to Isabella as a gift to prove my worth, to earn a seat at her table. I told myself it might soften her heart, or at least silence her sharp tongue. Looking back now, the very thought makes me sick. No amount of money could ever purchase dignity. As I held the envelope in my lap, my hands trembling, I realized it was not a gift anymore. It was a weapon, though not the kind I would use carelessly, because hidden beneath that envelope was another smaller one. That envelope did not hold money. It held truth. And truth, I had learned, could cut deeper than any blade. Weeks earlier, I had followed Isabella on one of her Thursday shopping trips. I had pretended to be too tired to cook, then slipped out quietly after her. What I saw outside a downtown hotel had frozen me in place. Isabella, in her white silk suit, embracing Victor Delgado, Adrian's oldest friend, the man who had toasted at our table, the man who had sworn loyalty to my son. The sight of their kiss was seared into me like a burn. I snapped a photo with shaking hands, hardly able to breathe, hardly able to believe what I was witnessing. That photo was now inside the smaller envelope, waiting. But that was not my only secret. Beneath both envelopes, wrapped in faded cloth, was a leather-bound journal. My husband Miguel's handwriting sprawled across the yellowed pages, a voice from the grave I had carried with me all these years. In those pages, he had written about Adrian's marriage, about the unease he felt when he first met Isabella. There is something in her smile that does not reach her eyes, he had written months before his death. Beware, Clara. Adrian is blinded by beauty. I fear he cannot see the storm behind her charm. I had dismissed those words at the time, believing grief had made Miguel overly cautious. But now, as I traced my fingers over his ink, I understood. He had seen what I had refused to see. Isabella's perfection was not perfection at all. It was a mask, a disguise, a trap. The three things sat before me on the desk: money, proof, and warning. Together they felt like a map of my life, my sacrifices, my discoveries, my husband's wisdom. I knew I could no longer remain silent. The envelope of cash would not be wasted on Isabella's greed. It would remain with me, a shield for whatever storms were coming. The photograph would be my dagger, sharp and undeniable. And Miguel's words would be my compass, reminding me that silence had already cost me too much. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For 5 years, Isabella had made me small, invisible, a shadow in my son's house. But in that quiet room with the evidence spread before me, I felt taller than I had in decades. I was no longer the widow on her knees, sweeping up broken glass. I was Clara Morales, and for the first time in years, I was preparing to fight. I thought that single photograph outside the hotel was enough to haunt me for the rest of my days. But the truth rarely stops at a single moment. It multiplies, digs deeper, refuses to let you look away. After that night with the envelope spread on my desk, I began to watch Isabella with sharper eyes. Her Thursday errands stretched longer than they should. Her perfume lingered in the hall hours before Adrian came home. And always, her phone was glued to her manicured hands, the screen tilted away from anyone who might glimpse it. One Friday afternoon, when Adrian was traveling for a conference in Chicago, Isabella announced she was going to spend the weekend at a wellness retreat by the ocean. She said it so casually, sliding her pearl earrings into place, that it almost sounded believable. But I remembered Miguel's words in his journal, "Her beauty hides storms." I decided to follow. I borrowed my neighbor's car, an old sedan with squeaky brakes, and drove south along the coast until the pastel-painted resort rose out of the horizon like a mirage. Families strolled hand in hand along the boardwalk. Couples sipped cocktails by the pool. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Isabella, my son's wife, her white linen dress flowing in the sea breeze. Her arm was looped through Victor Delgado's. Victor, the boy who had played basketball with Adrian in high school, who had stood beside him as best man at his wedding, who had eaten meals at my kitchen table for 20 years. He wasn't smiling now. He was looking at Isabella as if she were his world, as if my son's marriage, my son's trust meant nothing. I ducked behind a column, my heart pounding like a war drum, and raised my phone. The shutter clicked softly as I captured them kissing beneath the striped umbrellas of the resort cafe. But photographs weren't enough. I needed more than fleeting images. That evening, while Isabella showered back at the house, I dared to touch her phone. My hands shook, but desperation steadied me. The screen lit up with a thread of messages that stole my breath. "Thursday at the Ritz again," Victor had written. "Of course," Isabella replied. "Adrian never questions. He's too busy chasing deals. And further down, he'll never see it coming," she wrote. 2 more years and I'll walk away with half of everything." Victor's answer cut me to the bone. By then we'll have drained the company dry anyway. He's just a wallet with legs. I read until my stomach turned. 2 years of messages hidden in plain sight, stretching back to anniversaries, holidays, even the night Adrian had been in the hospital with exhaustion. While my son lay hooked to IV drips, his best friend and his wife were laughing in text bubbles about how gullible he was. And it wasn't only love they were stealing. I found email confirmations disguised as business transactions that showed money bleeding out of Adrian's company accounts into shell corporations. Thousands at first, then tens of thousands. I knew Adrian worked himself to the bone to keep his empire afloat, spending 16-hour days in sleek glass offices, while Isabella lounged at tennis clubs. Now I understood why his shoulders slumped deeper each month he was unknowingly carrying their betrayal on his back. I sat in my room that night, staring at the glowing screen bile rising in my throat. Rage trembled through me, not only for myself, but for Adrian. My boy had trusted them both. He had trusted his wife with his heart and his friend with his loyalty, and they had carved him open while he slept. The ocean photo, the resort kiss, the messages of mockery, the evidence of stolen funds they piled together into a mountain I could no longer ignore. My hands still shook, but it was no longer from fear. It was from resolve. For years, Isabella had treated me as a burden. Victor had smiled across my table as if he were family. But now, I held their secrets, their weapons turned against them. And I promised myself this: I would not let my son lose everything he had built. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was invisible. They thought wrong. When I pieced together the stolen messages and the photographs, my fury burned so hot it nearly consumed me. But anger alone wasn't enough. Isabella was cunning, Victor was clever, and Adrian was blind. If I confronted them with nothing more than my word, they would twist it, deny it, and make me look like the bitter old widow Isabella always painted me to be. I needed more than rage. I needed proof that no one could ignore. That was when I remembered Mr. Alvarez. Years ago, he had been a police officer in Miami, a man who still lived above a bakery near Little Havana. He was known in the neighborhood as discreet, sharp, and relentless. People said he carried his badge in his heart even after retirement. With trembling hands, I dialed his number, half expecting he would laugh at me, an old woman babbling about conspiracies. Instead, His voice was calm, steady. "Meet me tomorrow. Bring what you have." I arrived with my envelope of photos and the screenshots of messages, my palms slick with sweat. He listened carefully, his lined face giving nothing away, and when I finished, he nodded once. "You're right to be cautious. What you're describing, this isn't just infidelity. It smells of fraud. Organized fraud." Days turned into weeks as Alvarez dug where I couldn't. He followed paper trails through public records, bank accounts, and marriage certificates. Every few days, he would call me with updates, each one worse than the last. And then one afternoon, he handed me a thin manila folder that felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. Her name wasn't Isabella Morales. It wasn't even Isabella at all. According to the documents, her real name was Carmen Silva. 10 years earlier in Texas, she had been arrested under that name for marital fraud, marrying wealthy men, draining their accounts, disappearing before the law could catch up. She had used aliases in 3 different states. Sophia, Elena, Marissa. Each identity polished, each story airtight. She was a chameleon who wore lives like costumes. I stared at the mugshot inside the file, her hair darker, her face younger, but the same cold eyes I saw across my kitchen every morning. My stomach dropped. I had been living under the same roof as a stranger, a predator. And then came the final blow: she had never worked alone. Alvarez traced connections to an accomplice, a man who always appeared at the edges of her schemes. His name surfaced in police notes and financial records, always beside hers, Victor Delgado. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The betrayal was deeper than I could fathom. My son's best friend, the boy I had fed at my table, the man who toasted at every holiday, had been Carmen's partner, long before she ever set eyes on Adrian. Their friendship wasn't loyalty, it was strategy. Adrian had been chosen, targeted, played. The twist of the knife came when Alvarez introduced me to Teresa, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and hands that trembled as she clutched a photograph. She had once been engaged to a man she thought was Victor, while Isabella posed as her closest confidant. They had stolen everything from her savings jewelry, even the deed to her late parents' home. Teresa's voice cracked as she told me they vanished one night together. I never recovered a cent. Her story mirrored mine, only worse. And it confirmed what I dreaded. Adrian wasn't their first victim. He was just their most valuable one. I left Alvarez's office with the file pressed against my chest, the weight of it making it hard to breathe. Rage and grief swirled inside me like a storm, but beneath them both was clarity. I had lived too long in silence, but silence could no longer protect my son. That night, as Isabella Carmen sat at my dinner table sipping wine with her perfect smile, and Victor clapped Adrian on the back with false laughter, I studied them with new eyes. They thought they were untouchable. They thought no one could see the game. But I had the truth now, and the truth would be the rope they hung themselves with. The folder from Mr. Alvarez never left my side. I slept with it beneath my pillow, ate with it, on the table beside me, carried it in my handbag like a weapon, waiting for its moment. For weeks, I told myself to wait for the right opportunity, an opening where the truth would pierce through all of Isabella's lies. That chance arrived sooner than I expected. Adrian announced he was hosting a gala at one of Miami's most prestigious hotels. It was to celebrate a massive contract signing, the kind of event that would draw investors, lawyers, and local officials. He was radiant with pride when he told us, while Isabella Carmen stood behind him with that smile she had perfected, the smile that made strangers believe she was the backbone of his success. I stayed quiet, but inside me the storm roared. I knew what that night would become. The ballroom shimmered with golden light chandeliers raining down brilliance on tables lined with white linen and crystal glasses. Waiters in tuxedos glided between the guests, their trays heavy with champagne. Adrian stood tall in his tailored suit, shaking hands, glowing with the respect he had earned. And right beside him, Isabella dazzled in a sapphire gown, her laughter ringing like music, her hand clutching his arm as though she owned him. Victor hovered close, leaning in with that familiar false charm. I waited. I waited until dessert, until the moment Isabella rose from her seat, her glass lifted high, her voice carrying across the room, to Adrian, the man who built this dream. To our future, our family, and to our dearest friends who stand beside us. The crowd clapped, the crystal glasses clinked together, and Adrian's eyes glowed with gratitude. That was when I stood. My chair scraped loudly against the floor, cutting through the applause like a blade. The room turned. For once, no one ignored me. I walked slowly toward Isabella, the folder clutched in my hand. My voice was steady, though my heart thundered. If we're to toast to family, then the truth should sit at this table too. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Isabella's smile faltered just slightly, but enough. I placed the envelope in front of her, sliding it across the polished wood. "Open it," I said. She hesitated, then tore it open with trembling fingers. The first photograph spilled out the resort kiss, her lips pressed against Victor's under the striped umbrellas. Gasps broke out. Adrian's face drained of color as he snatched the picture, his hands shaking. "Isabella, what is this?" Victor shot up from his chair, his voice cracking. "This is nonsense, Adrian. Fabricated. She's trying to poison you." But before he could spin his lies, more documents slid free. Bank records, false marriage certificates, the mugshot of Carmen Silva, staring coldly from the past. The room exploded in whispers. Investors shifted uncomfortably. Lawyers leaned forward. Adrian's hands trembled as he flipped through the papers, his eyes darting between the evidence and the woman he thought he knew. Isabella tried to speak, but no words came, only a strangled sound, as though her mask had finally cracked. She collapsed back into her chair, her face pale as chalk, her sapphire gown suddenly looking like a costume. Victor reached for her, but Adrian's voice cut through, hoarse and broken. "Don't you dare touch her. Don't you dare." And then from the corner of the room, I saw movement. Lucia, my sweet granddaughter who had watched in silence for too long, broke free from her seat. She ran across the room, tears streaming down her cheeks, and threw her arms around me. Her small frame trembled against mine, and in that moment, 3 generations stood together, a granddaughter seeking strength, a mother demanding truth, a son on the edge of devastation. The ballroom, once filled with pride and glitter, had turned into a theater of betrayal. Adrian stared at the documents, his jaw clenched, his shoulders rigid. For the first time in years, I felt visible, not as the invisible servant in my son's house, but as the woman who had brought the truth to light. And as I held Lucia close, I whispered to her, though perhaps it was to myself as well, no more silence. The ballroom that night became a graveyard of illusions. The applause had died, the chandeliers still shone, but no one could look at Adrian without pity, or at Isabella without contempt. When the last guest hurried out whispering, Adrian remained frozen in his chair, staring at the damning documents scattered across the table like shards of his marriage. For a long time, none of us spoke. Then Adrian's voice, rough and broken, filled the silence. "How long have you known Mom?" I swallowed hard, my heart twisting. "Weeks," I admitted. I needed proof. I couldn't let her twist the truth against us. His face crumpled a mixture of rage and grief. He pushed the photos away as if they were poison. "I let her humiliate you for years, and I did nothing. I thought you were exaggerating being difficult." His voice cracked. I was blind. For the first time in a decade, I saw my son not as the powerful businessman, not as Isabella's trophy husband, but as the boy I had raised, the boy who once cried when he dropped his trumpet at a school concert, the boy who promised me he'd always protect me. I reached across the table and took his hand. "You see the truth now," I whispered, "and that is enough." The days that followed were a storm. Adrian filed for annulment and with Alvarez's guidance pressed charges. The courts uncovered the offshore accounts, the falsified documents, the years of siphoned funds. Isabella, or rather Carmen Silva, fought back with crocodile tears, and lawyers she could no longer afford. But the evidence was undeniable. The marriage was declared void, the assets frozen. Victor, true to his nature, tried to run. He disappeared for 3 weeks, his name whispered in headlines. But justice has a long reach. Alvarez called me one morning with news Victor had been arrested in Houston, caught using a false ID at a private airport. Hearing his name read alongside words like fraud and conspiracy filled me with a grim satisfaction. But justice in court was nothing compared to justice at home. For years, Isabella had made me invisible, a servant in my own son's life. Now Adrian insisted I sit at the head of the table. He cooked meals for me, simple stews, badly seasoned at first, but made with love. One evening, as we cleared the dishes together, he turned to me and said words I had waited a lifetime to hear. "I'm sorry, Mom, for not seeing you, for not believing you, for letting her silence you." Tears burned my eyes, but they were not bitter this time. They were cleansing. And then there was Lucia. Sweet, observant Lucia who had witnessed every cruelty in silence. One afternoon, she came into my room holding a stack of college brochures. "Grandma," she said, her voice steady, "I want to study law. I want to fight for people who can't fight for themselves like you did for Dad." My heart swelled. I pulled her into my arms, knowing that the seed of justice had taken root in her because she had seen firsthand what silence costs. Now when I sit in the garden with my morning coffee, the sun warming my face, I no longer feel like a ghost. I feel present, visible, whole. The neighbors greet me with respect. Adrian seeks my counsel before every major decision. Lucia sits beside me, with her textbooks asking questions, dreaming of the day she will stand in court. I have lived through humiliation, betrayal, and lies. But I have also lived to see truth prevail, to see my family restored, to see the next generation inspired to fight for justice. For years, Isabella tried to erase me, but in the end, it was her lies that vanished, and my voice, the voice she tried to silence, echoed louder than ever. I am Clara Morales, and I am no longer invisible. What do you think about Clara's journey? Did it remind you of something you've seen or felt in your own life? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Your stories and voices matter here. Don't forget to hit subscribe to Everyday Family Conflicts so you won't miss the next powerful story we're building this community together.